Story 1. I've never been one for ghost stories or the supernatural. As a Marine, I was trained to face tangible threats, not imaginary ones. But something happened during my time guarding the Veterans Memorial that I can't explain, no matter how hard I try. It was 2015, and I'd been assigned to the night shift at a sprawling memorial complex dedicated to fallen soldiers. The centerpiece was a somber tribute to those lost in various conflicts, surrounded by a veterans cemetery that stretched into the shadowy tree line. My job was simple: patrol the grounds, ensure everything was secure, and maintain a respectful vigil for our fallen comrades. Most nights were uneventful. The silence was occasionally broken by the rustle of leaves or a distant animal call, but nothing more. I'd grown accustomed to the solitude, finding a strange peace in my solitary walks among the headstones. That changed on a moonless night in late October. The air was crisp, carrying the first hints of winter. I'd just started my rounds when I noticed something odd near the oldest section of the cemetery. A faint bluish glow peeked through the overgrown bushes at the perimeter fence. At first, I thought it might be kids messing around or some tech-savvy visitor leaving an LED tribute. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was a charge in the air, like the moment before a lightning strike. And then I heard it, singing. Not just one voice, but what sounded like a choir, soft and distant. I pushed through the undergrowth, my heart pounding. What I saw next is burned into my memory. An old, weathered headstone stood before me, unremarkable save for the ornate cross carved into its face. But that cross, it was glowing. A vibrant electric blue that pulsed in time with the ethereal singing. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that my training kicked in. But the truth is, I ran. I sprinted back to the guard station, radio in hand, calling for my relief to come early. I spent the rest of the shift in the cab of his truck, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When dawn broke, I felt foolish. It must have been a trick of the light, I told myself. Or maybe I dozed off on duty and dreamed the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to go back. In the harsh light of day, the headstone looked ordinary. No glow, no singing, just weathered marble with a simple cross. I checked for hidden lights or speakers, anything that could explain what I'd experienced. Nothing. I never told my superiors about that night. Who'd believe me? But I couldn't shake the memory, and it wasn't long before I started asking questions. The groundskeeper, an old Vietnam vet named Frank, had been there for decades. When I casually mentioned the odd headstone, his eyes narrowed. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. "The blue cross." Frank told me a story that had been passed down through generations of memorial guardians. The grave belonged to a Civil War nurse named Sarah. She'd served in field hospitals, comforting the dying when nothing else could be done. Soldiers spoke of her angelic voice, how her hymns seemed to ease their passing. After the war, Sarah dedicated her life to caring for veterans. She died in 1894, and grateful soldiers insisted she be buried among them. Her grave was marked with a simple cross, her name lost to time. "But here's the thing," Frank said, leaning in close. "Every few years, someone sees that cross light up. Always at night, always when someone nearby is suffering." I thought he was pulling my leg, but Frank was dead serious. He pulled out an old logbook, filled with entries dating back decades. Each described a similar experience: the glowing cross, the otherworldly singing, and each time, within days, news would reach the memorial of a veteran's passing. "Some say it's Sarah," Frank explained, "still watching over her boys, calling them home when it's time." I'd like to say that solved the mystery, that Frank's story put my mind at ease, but it didn't. If anything, it left me with more questions than answers. I continued my night shifts, always a little more alert when passing that secluded corner of the cemetery. Months went by without incident, and I started to convince myself it had all been in my head. Then came a bitterly cold night in January. I was hurrying through my rounds, eager to get back to the warmth of the guard station, when I saw it again. That unmistakable blue glow, somehow even brighter against the snowy ground. This time, I forced myself to approach. The singing grew louder with each step, a hauntingly beautiful chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Standing before the glowing cross, I felt no fear. Instead, an overwhelming sense of peace washed over me. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in the ethereal song, but eventually the glow faded, and the voices drifted away on the winter wind. I was alone again, with only the silent headstones for company. The next morning, we received word that one of our local World War II veterans had passed away in the night. He'd gone peacefully in his sleep, his family said, with a smile on his face. I've thought a lot about what to make of all this. Part of me still wants to find a rational explanation, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination or some elaborate hoax. But another part of me has come to accept that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Story 2, I never believed in ghosts until I joined the Taiwanese Marines. For the sake of this story, my name is Chen Wei-tin, and I served as a drill sergeant at a base nestled in the mountains of central Taiwan for over 2 decades. The stories I'm about to share have haunted me for years, and I feel it's time to finally put them into words. Our base was rumored to be built near an old mass grave from the occupation era. Most of us dismissed these tales as superstition, but over the years, I witnessed things that shook my skepticism to its core. It was a sweltering August night when Private Lin came to me, his face pale and hands trembling. He'd been on guard duty, overlooking the firing range where we kept our practice targets. Crude figures shaped from wood and clay, painted to resemble enemy soldiers. "Sergeant Chen," he stammered, I saw something impossible." I braced myself for some foolish excuse, but what he said next chilled me to the bone. One of the clay soldiers, it moved. It laid down its rifle and spoke. It said, "Damn, I'm tired." Clear as day. I wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination, but the terror in Lin's eyes was too real. He'd fainted from shock and had to be carried back to the barracks. We found him the next morning, still shaken, unable to explain what he'd seen. That incident was just the beginning. As the years passed, more inexplicable events occurred, each one etching itself into my memory. One evening, I decided to go on one of my regular snake hunting excursions. The twilight hours were perfect. The heat rising from the ground drove the snakes from their holes, making them easier to spot. Armed with a bag, a long stick, and my trusty flashlight, I set out across the field. As I zigzagged through the tall grass, my path took me closer to an old abandoned outhouse. It had been there long before our base was built, its wooden frame now rotting and overgrown with vines. I'd passed it countless times before without a second thought, but that night was different. When I was about 10 yards away, a sense of unease washed over me. Every instinct screamed that I shouldn't go any closer. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and died. Cursing under my breath, I smacked it against my palm, thinking the batteries must be loose. To my surprise, the moment I turned to face the main base, the light sparked back to life. Relieved, I turned back toward the outhouse to resume my hunt. The flashlight immediately went dark again. Puzzled, I swung back toward the base. The light returned. I repeated this several times, my unease growing with each flicker. Okay, I get it," I muttered, addressing the empty air. "I'm sorry for intruding. I'll leave now." I walked calmly back to base, my heart racing. The flashlight worked perfectly the entire way back, never flickering once. These encounters left me shaken, but they were nothing compared to what happened during the typhoon of '97. It had been an unusually calm summer, but the meteorologists warned us that a monster storm was brewing. When it hit, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. The wind howled for days, bending trees like rubber and pelting us with rain so thick it was hard to breathe outside. We hunkered down, reinforcing what we could and praying the rest would hold. After what felt like an eternity, the storm passed, leaving us to survey the damage. The base was a mess, roof tiles scattered everywhere, windows shattered, and debris littering every surface. But the true shock came when we reached the old hill overlooking the base. For centuries, a massive banyan tree had stood there, its roots twisting deep into the earth. At its base sat a small Buddhist shrine, a place where many soldiers would go to find peace or pray for good fortune. The typhoon had finally done what centuries could not. It had torn the great tree from the ground, its massive root system now exposed to the air like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. But the shrine hadn't moved an inch. The red silk covering that draped over it hung perfectly still, as if the storm had never happened. Not a single piece of debris touched the sacred space. We stood there in awe, Marines hardened by years of training, rendered speechless by this impossible sight. It was Private Wu who finally broke the silence. "It's a sign," he whispered. "No matter what comes against us, our spirit will remain unbroken." His words spread through the ranks like wildfire, boosting morale as we faced the daunting task of rebuilding. I found myself staring at that shrine for hours, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In all my years of service, I'd never witnessed anything that defied explanation quite like this. But the incident that truly shook me to my core happened just a few months later. We had a young recruit, fresh-faced and eager, named Huang. One day during a routine training exercise in the surrounding forest, Huang vanished. At first we thought he might have deserted, but as hours passed with no sign of him, fear set in. I organized a search party, and we combed the mountains until nightfall forced us back. The next morning we found him. Huang was huddled in a damp cave, his uniform torn and muddy. But it wasn't his physical state that alarmed us. It was the look in his eyes. He stared blankly ahead, trembling, unable to speak. We tried for days to get him to tell us what happened, what he'd seen out there in the darkness. But Huang never uttered another word. Within a week, he was quietly discharged and sent home. Years later, long after I'd retired, I ran into Huang's older brother in Taipei. Over drinks, he confided in me that Huang had finally started to open up about that night. "He says he saw them, Sergeant Chen," the brother whispered, his voice tight. "The dead. Hundreds of them wandering through the mist. Some in old military uniforms, others in civilian clothes, all with eyes that glowed like embers." I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering the rumors of mass graves near our base. Had Huang stumbled upon something that was never meant to be disturbed? These experiences changed me. I entered the Marines as a pragmatic man, skeptical of anything I couldn't see or touch. But over those years, I learned that there are things in this world that defy explanation, echoes of the past that linger in forgotten places. I don't expect everyone to believe these stories. Hell, there are days I still struggle to believe them myself. But I know what I saw, what I felt, and I carry with me the conviction that there's more to this world than what meets the eye. Story 3. It happened 3 years ago when I was working as a security guard at an old government research facility. The place was massive, mostly underground, and parts of it dated back to the Cold War era. My job was simple: patrol the active areas, monitor security feeds, and report anything unusual. Little did I know, unusual would take on a whole new meaning that night. It was around 2 a.m. during a particularly long 12-hour shift. The facility was a maze of corridors, and I'd been walking the same routes for months. Boredom and fatigue were setting in hard. I decided to take a quick detour, just to break up the monotony. Big mistake. I turned down a hallway I'd never explored before. The lights were dim, flickering occasionally, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air felt thicker, almost stagnant. I should have turned back, but curiosity got the better of me. As I ventured deeper, the modern fixtures gave way to older tech. I passed rooms filled with ancient-looking computer banks and filing cabinets. Dust covered everything. It was like stepping into a time capsule. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere ahead. My heart started racing, but I convinced myself it was just old pipes or the ventilation system acting up. I pressed on, following the sound. The corridor opened into a large room, easily the size of a warehouse. Rows of strange machines lined the walls, their purposes a mystery to me. In the center stood a massive cylinder, maybe 20 feet tall, with a small window near the top. As I approached, the thumping grew louder. It was coming from inside the cylinder. I pulled out my flashlight, my hands shaking as I shone it through the grimy window. I'll never forget what I saw. Something moved inside, a dark mass, pulsing and shifting. For a split second, I swear I saw an eye, huge and inhuman, staring right back at me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. That's when the alarms started blaring. Red emergency lights bathed the room in a hellish glow. The cylinder began to hiss and creak, like something was trying to get out. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, through twisting corridors and up countless stairs. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back. When I finally burst into the main security office, I was drenched in sweat and gasping for air. My supervisor looked at me like I was crazy. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "We've got a system malfunction in Section D. Some old backup generator kicked on and tripped half the alarms in the building." I couldn't speak. I just nodded and collapsed into a chair trying to catch my breath. They never asked about where I'd been or what I'd seen. Maybe they didn't want to know. The next day, I overheard snippets of conversation. Phrases like containment breach and asset relocation were tossed around by stern-looking men in suits. Within a week, that entire section of the facility was sealed off. New security protocols were put in place, and we were given strict orders never to discuss what happened that night. Story 4. I've always considered myself a rational person. As a sergeant in the United States Army, I was trained to analyze situations logically, to find explanations for the unexplainable. But my time working at Arlington National Cemetery challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. It was the fall of 2018 when I received my assignment to Arlington. The cemetery was undergoing a massive digitization project, and they needed soldiers to help catalog and verify graves. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but there was something profound about ensuring that every fallen hero was accounted for, their final resting place accurately recorded for posterity. The days were long, filled with careful measurements, cross-referencing old paper records, and inputting data into ruggedized tablets. But it was the night shifts that really stuck with me. There's something surreal about walking through rows upon rows of white headstones under a moonlit sky, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of gravel under your boots. I'd been at Arlington for about 3 months when I first heard the whispers. It was during a break in the guardhouse near the tomb of the unknown soldier. A couple of tomb guards were talking in low voices, glancing around as if worried about being overheard. "I'm telling you, man, I heard it clear as day," one of them said, his eyes wide. "Marching, like a whole platoon passing by. But when I looked, there was nothing there." His buddy nodded solemnly. "It happens sometimes, especially on foggy nights. Some say it's the old guard, still keeping watch." I remember scoffing internally. Ghost stories were for kids and tourists, not for soldiers. I chalked it up to sleep deprivation and overactive imaginations. Little did I know I was about to have my own encounter with the unexplainable. It was a crisp October night, just a few days before Halloween. My team was working in Section 60, cataloging some of the more recent graves from the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The air was heavy with fog, limiting visibility to just a few yards ahead. I was working with Private Jenkins, a young soldier fresh out of basic training. We'd split up to cover more ground, keeping in radio contact as we moved through the rows of headstones. The fog seemed to muffle all sound, creating an eerie bubble of silence around us. As I finished logging another grave, I glanced up and saw a figure in ACS about 20 yards ahead. Assuming it was Jenkins, I called out, "Hey, Jenkins, you find anything interesting over there?" There was no response, but the figure seemed to turn slightly, as if acknowledging me. Irritated by the lack of radio discipline, I keyed my mic. "Jenkins, do you copy? What's your location?" To my shock, Jenkins' voice crackled through the radio from behind me. "I copy, Sergeant. I'm about 50 meters south of your last known position. Everything okay?" A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned around. There was Jenkins, emerging from the fog, tablet in hand, and a questioning look on his face. When I whipped back to where I'd seen the other figure, there was nothing but empty air and rows of silent headstones. "Sergeant Reeves? You look like you've seen a ghost," Jenkins said, concern evident in his voice. I wanted to laugh it off, to come up with some rational explanation. Maybe it was another member of our team, though I knew that was impossible. We were the only ones assigned to this section tonight. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, my tired mind misinterpreting shadows in the fog. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. A soldier, standing watch among the fallen, only to vanish into the night. "It's nothing, Jenkins," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's get back to work. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dawn." For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every rustle of leaves sounded like whispered conversations just out of earshot. I found myself jumping at small noises, my hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. When our shift finally ended, I was more exhausted than I'd ever been, but sleep eluded me. I lay in my bunk, replaying the incident over and over in my mind, trying to find some logical explanation. But every scenario I came up with felt forced, inadequate to explain what I'd experienced. The next few weeks were a struggle. I threw myself into the work, hoping that keeping busy would push the memory to the back of my mind. But every night, as darkness fell over Arlington, I found myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that ghostly soldier again. I started paying more attention to the stories shared by the tomb guards and other cemetery staff. Tales of unexplained footsteps echoing through empty corridors, of lights flickering in abandoned buildings, of visitors swearing they'd seen soldiers in outdated uniforms standing at attention beside certain graves. Each story chipped away at my skepticism, forcing me to confront the possibility that there were things in this world beyond my understanding. One particularly memorable account came from an elderly groundskeeper named Frank. He'd worked at Arlington for over 40 years and had seen his fair share of strange occurrences. Late one night, while locking up the maintenance shed, he heard what sounded like a bugle playing taps. Thinking it was unusual for a ceremony at that hour, he went to investigate. What he found shook him to his core. "There was no one there," Frank told me, his weathered face serious. "But the music kept playing, and then I saw them, hundreds of soldiers, all in different uniforms from different eras, standing at attention. They were transparent like smoke, but I could see every detail. It lasted maybe a minute, and then they just faded away." I wanted to dismiss Frank's story as the ramblings of an old man, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't be so sure. The conviction in his eyes, the slight tremor in his voice as he recounted the experience, it all felt too real to be a simple fabrication. As the weeks turned into months, I began to develop a new perspective on Arlington and the work we were doing there. It wasn't just about maintaining a cemetery or updating records. We were custodians of memory, preserving the legacy of those who had given everything for their country. And perhaps in some way I couldn't fully comprehend, those soldiers were still there, standing watch over their fallen comrades, unwilling or unable to leave their posts even in death. The incident with the vanishing soldier wasn't the last unexplained event I encountered at Arlington, but it was the one that affected me the most profoundly. It forced me to confront the limits of my understanding and open my mind to possibilities I'd previously dismissed.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.